Afternoon, folks, and welcome into the Resene specified versus perceived colour webinar today. We're lucky enough to have Zena O'Connor back with us again and beaming in from home base in Sydney. Hello there, Zena.
Hi there.
Now, Zena's presented a number of colour-focused webinars for Resene in the past. If you haven't seen any of these, please do jump onto our website and have a look at them, as all previous webinars are there to view at any time. I'll run through a very quick bio on Zena. Zena is an independent research consultant who holds a PhD from the University of Sydney, a master's degree in design and a bachelor's degree also. So very well qualified to be talking on all things colour for us today. We should have time at the end of the webinar today for questions, so please do type them in and we'll try and fire a few Zena's way at the end. As always, today's webinar will be available for viewing again on our website in a day or two. So righto, let's get into it and I'll pass over to you, Zena.
Thank you so much, Rod. And today we're going to be talking about specified versus perceived colour and some of the strategies that we can use to manage the factors that impact interior and exterior colour. So colour scheme specification for both interior and exterior buildings facades can sometimes be problematic, not simply in terms of aesthetics, but due to the range of factors that can impact or influence perception of specified colour, creating a situation where perceived colour differs from specified colour. These factors can include the complexity of colour itself, colour undertones in paint, the impact of contextual simultaneous contrast, light reflectance values that are inherent in all paint colours, the impact of reflected light and reflected colour, the impact of textured surfaces, and the impact of ambient lighting and also aspect, the way a building faces in terms of the natural light it receives or doesn't receive. So to start with, colour is a complex phenomenon. It's a very variable phenomenon. In fact, it varies in terms of its attributes of hue, saturation, which is the chromatic intensity or purity of a colour, as well as tonal value, the lightness or darkness of a colour. So here we have a sample of blue. It's not quite full saturation, it's lower down from full saturation, but it's relatively light in terms of its tonal value. It's been estimated that we can distinguish between 1.8 million and 10 million different colour nuances. So that's a whole heap of different hues at varying tonal values and at varying saturation levels. When it comes to colour in the built environment, the process of colour scheme development can become problematic, initially due to the complexity of colour. And here we've got a little colour slider, we've got the hue slide at the top, we've got the saturation slide in the middle, and we've got the tonal value slide at the bottom. And as you'll notice, as the little slides move along, it changes the quality of that colour. It might be strong saturation, it might be lower saturation, it might be quite light in tonal value, or it might be quite dark in tonal value. So colour scheme development for interior spaces and exterior facades is invariably a process of juggling a range of factors that include those specified colour options, as well as the factors that impact perceived colour, plus the client's own aims and agenda. I won't focus too much on client aims and agenda, except to say that some of the techniques I mention here can help to address those client aims. A useful first step that I always take when specifying colour for interior spaces or exterior building facades involves undertaking an environmental colour mapping study. And I do this because colour in the built environment invariably includes existing fixed colours, and these are the colours that occur in the different types of construction materials such as steel, stone, brick and concrete, through to glass, exterior shade, privacy panels, window and door frames, awnings and the like. And I also colour map the colours that are the variable colours that might exist in the form of painted or treated surfaces, textured materials, wallpapers, accent panels, and so on. And it's the colours of these variable colours that can be changed perhaps more easily and relatively cost effectively, as opposed to changing the colour of the existing fixed colours. In this example, there's a range of fixed colours which include variations of red that can be seen in the Rosso marble flooring. There are variations in the sandstone colour, and these variations go from light mid-ochre to shadows in the stone, which appear as a sort of a bluish greyish colour. And then we've also got the deep rich timber tones, which are the panels around the lift doorways. So the same colour mapping process can be applied to a building exterior. An example of the complexity of developing facade colour specification options is a recent project that we worked on in Kent Street in Sydney's CBD area. This project, which is a 28-storey apartment building, featured an extensive array of fixed coloured construction materials. So it's items 4 through to 7. We had grey-green window and door frames. We had slightly darker grey-green awning that's at the front entrance there. We had light-coloured sandstone details in the columns and the plinth at the top. And we had a relatively dark grey granite base at ground level. The windows in this building featured blue-green glazing. So in fact, the fixed colours were a kind of a patchwork of colours, if you like. In this particular project, one of the client aims was for the building to stand out and be distinctive relative to the neighbouring buildings. This particular illustration shows the project at the centre of the image. It's the light ochre coloured building, and it's the one with the bluish green glazing. Alongside its neighbouring buildings as seen from Sydney Harbour. So as you can see, there's a relative lack of differentiation between the project apartment building and the similar coloured adjacent buildings. While the light coloured buildings, there's one to the left of the image, and the dark grey buildings tend to stand out more in this context. Another key aim for this particular project was a client preference for a facade colour scheme that avoided the undertone of the existing ochre facade colour. This undertone became way more apparent at sunrise and at sunset. So in developing specified colour options for this project, the process needed to address the paint colour undertones as well as the likely outcomes from contextual simultaneous contrast. I'll be talking about that a bit later. And these were two key factors that impacted perceived colour for this particular project. By documenting the existing colours of the building itself, both from the street and from the harbour, as well as documenting the existing colours of the neighbouring buildings, we were able to develop an array of specified colour options for the client that addressed any of these perceived colour issues as well as our client's aims. So I mentioned colour paint undertone there, and that's a key factor that impacts specified colour. Colour undertone is inherent in all paint colours, and the undertone can impact perceived colour, how the colour actually appears in situ. So all paint colours have an undertone, And this may not always be apparent when we're looking at the little chip or at the sample online. So many greens, for example, can have a yellowish undertone or a bluish undertone or an ochre brown undertone. I notice with the Resene paints online and also in the fan decks, they always indicate exactly what the undertone is, which I find to be very helpful. So this particular illustration on the right-hand side features 25 popular white paint colours. As you'll notice, some have a yellowish or an ochre undertone, others have a slightly pink undertone, some greenish, some bluish, and some have a grey undertone. While the undertone may not be immediately obvious in the small paint chip, it can become very obvious on a large painted surface or under different lighting conditions. So with the particular project that we worked on in Kent Street, the undertone became particularly obvious at sunrise and sunset. So the ideal option is to ensure that the specified colour will meet the client aims and preferences and ensure that the undertone isn't a problem, is to paint a very large sample on a section of a key wall. A wall that gets plenty of light as well as shade. This sample area, you may wish to do 2 sample areas. This sample area will reveal the impact of the undertone on perceived colour, especially under those different lighting conditions. One that gets, say, full artificial light, one that is in shadow. Another factor that impacts perceived colour is simultaneous contrast. And you've probably seen plenty of these types of images where a single colour is displayed in a grid like this one here, and it's surrounded by multiple different colour variations. Here's the same grey surrounded by 9 different colours. And you'll notice that the same grey will appear somewhat lighter in some boxes and somewhat darker in others. So for example, when the same grey is surrounded entirely by white, it looks quite a bit darker than, say, the grey that's surrounded by the dark blue bottom right. It looks quite a bit lighter. So simultaneous contrast occurs when contextual colour impacts the perception of a colour sample, or in our case, a colour wall. So simultaneous contrast can occur in interior spaces, impacting the perception of specified colour. This grid features Resene rice cake at the centre of each of the squares. And Resene rice cake is surrounded by an array of different white paint colours. We recently worked on a kitchen, and the client's preferred kitchen cabinet colour was in fact Resene white rice cake. However, the walls of the kitchen, it was quite a large kitchen, the walls of the kitchen were white. And we were able to demonstrate that rice cake would appear slightly darker and slightly kind of murkier due to the impact of simultaneous contrast. We recommended a different colour option for the walls to avoid this very strong and obvious difference between specified colour and perceived colour. Simultaneous contrast also occurs with exterior building facades. In this example, the preferred exterior colour was a light terracotta colour. However, the building was completely surrounded by dark green trees. The impact of this dark green contextual colour from the dark green trees was that it set up a simultaneous contrast effect with the specified paint colour, making that terracotta appear lighter in hue and tonal value. To overcome this, specifying a slightly darker, slightly more intense terracotta colour can mitigate this problem with perceived colour that can arise due to simultaneous contrast in an environmental context like this one. Here's the same set of specified colours and perceived colours. You'll notice that the client's specified facade colour, which is specified colour number 1 on the far left here, actually needed to be slightly darker and deeper as per specified colour number 2 to achieve the preferred specified colour of a light terracotta. And this is what happens when colour appears in an environment that is say, particularly green, dark green, like this environment. It does set up this environmental simultaneous contrast effect. Another issue that impacts variations between specified colour and perceived colour is light reflectance values. All paint colours have a light reflectance value. White and lighter colours have a high light reflectance value, while darker colours and black have a very low light reflectance value. Perhaps more importantly, a high light reflectance value means that light is reflected, but also less heat is absorbed when it comes to exterior colour. With darker colours, darker exterior colours, less light is reflected, more heat from sunlight is absorbed, and in this respect, exterior colour can also have an impact on heating and cooling costs. The more that heat from sunlight is absorbed, the more it's going to impact interior heating and cooling costs. Another issue with low reflectance colours, especially mid to dark colours, is that due to the heat that they do absorb, they may not be suitable for some exterior substrates and may in fact cause some damage to the substrate, such as warping or premature failure. Resene have developed a cool colour technology to address this very issue, and cool colour paints are engineered to absorb less heat. So you can in fact go with a darker exterior colour. It will reflect some light, and more importantly, it will absorb less heat. So light reflectance values have an impact on interior spaces. Here's a relatively extreme example, if you like, comparing a white ceiling in basically the same apartment, 1 story below, with a red ceiling in the apartment above. The red ceiling has a much lower light reflectance value. It reflects way less light into the room itself. And it also imbues the surfaces of the room with a kind of a reddish glow, if you like, a darker tone. While the levels of natural and artificial light are similar in both of these rooms, almost identical, if you like, the amount of reflected light in the white coloured dining room is far greater than in the dining room with the red painted ceiling. The lighter coloured interior details, such as the rugs and chairs on the left, help to make the room appear lighter, brighter due to all of that reflected light, and also marginally larger. So reflected colour can also impact variations between perceived colour and specified colour. Light toned colours, light colours and whites can reflect other colours, especially if there's a slight sheen to the paint. And it can reflect those colours that may be adjacent to the interior space. So a room that features perhaps the red ceiling, like the dining room in the previous example, or a yellow glazed ceiling, will imbue the rest of the room with that reddish or yellowish tint due to that reflected colour. In these images, the office on the left features yellow down one side of the room. Plus it also has some views to nature through that interesting looking ceiling detail. And you can see that these colours, especially the yellowish and the green, slightly greenish tinged wall, these colours are reflected on the light coloured wall opposite. Similarly, in the image on the right, The green exterior installation, which is stunning and perfect for its location in Jakarta, tends to cause a greenish hue to be subtly reflected inside to that interior space just inside this balcony area. Knowing that reflected colour may impact interior colour can perhaps change some decisions regarding specified colour. An interior that experiences a greenish hue, perhaps from reflected colour outside, the outside natural elements, for example, may prompt a selection of colours that lack that green undertone, so as not to reinforce the greenness in the interior space. Alternatively, a warm undertone in the paint may help to offset some of that reflected greenness. Another factor that can impact a difference between specified colour and perceived colour is texture, a textured surface. So any variation of a rough surface, textured surface, will cause even the slightest of shadows to occur. And these tend to darken the appearance of specified colour. This is obvious in this illustration here, where the textured areas start to appear slightly darker from a distance due to that textured surface and the shadows that texture tends to cause. To overcome the impact of textured surface, marginally increase the lightness level of the specified colour to counteract those texture shadows. Similarly, variations between flat, sheen and gloss paint finishes will also impact perceived colour. Flat paint generally doesn't reflect too much light, while satin, semi-gloss and full gloss will reflect to varying degrees artificial and natural light. In the image at right, a wall painted in flat and semi-gloss stripes reflects both the artificial and the natural light. And you can notice that in that some of the reflections are warm coloured, like the warm coloured light from the lights above, and sort of a cool reflected light from the artificial light that it's reflecting. So these can add a level of warmth or a level of coolness to the specified colour. While these variations may be intended, it's good to know that different qualities of light will have an impact on appearance of specified colour, as will different qualities of satin, semi-gloss and full gloss paint. Variations in ambient lighting will also impact and create differences between specified colour and perceived colour. So natural light and artificial light varies considerably in colour tone, if you like. Natural lighting may appear bright and colourless on a clear sunny day. However, at different times of day can throw a different quality and a different colour tone of coloured light. Sunrise and sunset tend to imbue an environment with pink and golden tones, and these in turn have an impact on perceived colour. The different colour tones of artificial light not only change the appearance of specified colour, but they can also change the ambience of interior spaces. Warm-toned artificial lighting imbues interiors with a sense of warmth and will also bring out any warm-hued undertone that may be in the paint colour. Conversely, cool-coloured artificial lighting will add a bluish tinge to a room and will also bring to the fore any cool-hued paint undertone. And this is particularly obvious in these clever illustrations, which show exactly the same room under different colour tones of lighting. So due to the strength of direct sunlight, variations in natural lighting can perhaps have the greatest impact on perceptions of colour. In the illustration on the left, research indicates that perceived colour tends to appear 20 to 25% more whitish in direct sunlight if the facade carries a strong, intense colour. That is, it's relatively high in saturation. In this particular diagram, which has been taken from the research, W at the top of the diagram represents whiteness, while S down the bottom of the diagram represents blackness. And C to the far right of the diagram represents chromaticity or saturation, the purity of colour. So as you can see with those little arrows, the arrows are moving away from the saturated end of the triangle towards the white end of the triangle. So that's illustrating that perceived colour tends to appear 20 to 25% more whitish in direct sunlight if the facade carries a relatively strong facade colour, saturated facade colour. In addition, in direct sunlight, perceived colour may appear 20% more yellowish if the facade colour is a pale, light-toned colour. So we've got two issues there. One is that with saturated colour, direct sunlight will make it appear slightly more whitish, and with pale colours, it may make the facade colour appear slightly more yellowish in direct sunlight. So this is some of the recent research that's been looking at the impact of direct sunlight on facade colour in real situations. In this example from a recent project that we worked on, the client wanted the interior colour, which was Resene alabaster, to flow through from the interior space through to the balcony. It was one very, very long wall that ran from the interior space through to the balcony area. The interior wall received relatively lower levels of light than the balcony, which received a higher level of direct light. To counteract these variations in ambient lighting from the slightly lower light level inside to the greater level of lighting outside, we needed to apply a slightly darker colour that would appear the same. So we wanted a colour that would make the interior alabaster colour appear the same on the balcony. We played around with a few options and we came up with Resene quarter T, which, as you'll notice in the example on the right side of this illustration, it is a slightly darker, slightly duller colour. It varied in hue and tonal value. But what happened was when we painted it, when it was painted on the wall, the variations in light meant that the balcony wall appeared almost identical to the interior wall. Down the bottom there, we've got two little boxes, perceived colour interior, perceived colour exterior. So alabaster appeared slightly duller due to the relatively lower natural light, while the exterior colour appeared slightly darker due to the greater level of sunlight. And the result was that they appeared almost identical. Happy client, which was a great outcome. So aspect is another factor that does in fact impact specified colour. Due to variations in natural lighting, building aspect is very important when considering which way to go with specified colour. This particular room, again, it's the same apartment. On the left-hand side, we've got the living room and the apartment below. Right-hand side, we've got the living room, the apartment above. Both rooms face the same way. They both face northeast and receive a considerable amount of natural light due to the aspect as well as the abundance of windows. The selection of white for the room on the right hand involved quite a few iterations of colour samples painted directly onto the walls. We wanted to find a white that would be able to deal with those high levels of natural light and would not be blindingly bright on a sunny day in summer. It cannot be stressed enough how important it was to work with these painted samples. Every interior space differs in terms of its aspect, the amount of windows, and hence the amount of natural light coming into that space. We were keen to find a white that was a warm white, which was the client's preference, but one that wouldn't be a blindingly bright white. So in the one in the living room on the left-hand side, the option was for that particular owner, they went with a cool white, but you'll notice that there were issues with the reflection, the light reflection from the highly polished timber floor. Of course, the selection of white would be very, very different for a room that faces perhaps south, or a room that has less windows and therefore letting in less light. So here is the same issue with exterior facade. This particular building in North Sydney faces northeast and gets very, very strong sunlight throughout the day. The choice of an undiluted bright white resulted in very, very, very bright white facade. Unless the client was perhaps visually challenged, this level of brightness may not have been perhaps their preference. No doubt they specified white, and without going any further, that's exactly what they got, a bright, blindingly white facade. An alternative that would have achieved perhaps a more appropriate result would have been a white that is subdued and somewhat like diluted in terms of hue and tonal value to reduce the intense level of brightness in this particular project. So to conclude, there are a number of factors that directly impact and influence perception of specified colour, creating a situation where specified colour can differ from perceived colour. Given the variety and variability of the factors that impact specified colour, an ideal way to match specified colour preferences to the resulting colour in terms of the actual perceived colour in situ, and to avoid any kind of issue with client aims, is to paint a relatively large sample on different parts of an interior wall or an exterior facade, and to view these under as many different lighting conditions as possible. Finally, another issue that may seem obvious but which creates problems is when specified colour from a particular paint company like Resene is substituted with colour from another paint supplier. This inevitably creates a mismatch in hue, saturation and tonal value. And we're currently dealing with this issue with our Kent Street project, the 28-storey apartment building. With this particular project, the owner's management company uses a surface paint supplier that is outside of the usual suppliers. It's a company I've never come across before. I'm not sure why they've gone with this particular company. It's a very small company. But when what's happening is I've specified certain colours. When this particular paint company tries to replicate them, they simply can't. And it's creating quite a difference between specified colour and also colours that the owners have agreed to, and the colours that this particular paint company are creating. My preference with specifying colours is to always use Resene, and the reason that I do that, this isn't a sell job on Resene, it's because Resene specify their colours using hex codes, and I find that that is an ideal way to specify exactly the colour that we're after. I can then translate that hex code into my colour mapping studies and illustrate to the client what the resulting perceived colour is more likely to look like with the specified colours that we're suggesting. So that's the end of the presentation. Thank you all for listening, and I hope that you've picked up some strategies there that help to deal with some of these factors that impact interior and exterior colour. Thank you very much.
That was another super interesting presentation today. Thanks, Zena. We have had a few questions roll in throughout, so we'll just get straight into those. Now, David's asked a question around software modeling of to show clients the actual contrast in the colours, as you mentioned. Is there anything available at present?
Yes, yes. Look, there are. There's I do two main sort of techniques. One is I use an app or a software called Canva, Canva, and that particular app is very useful in terms of creating the color mapping grids that I use, and I'm able to identify the exact colors in the images that I've captured using digital technology of the interior or the exterior of the buildings. And I'm able to identify those colors using hex codes. The other option that I go with as well is I organize renders, again using digital color and Photoshop. And in using Photoshop, I'm able to identify the color area that needs to be painted, and we're able to slide in one color and slide out another. So I always offer a client 3, maybe 4, maybe 5 options, and we're able to easily slide in and slide out those different colored options and print them out on large A3 photographic samples.
Very good. Question from Dominique. If you used an undiluted white on a southern facing exterior facade, would you still get that blinding white effect?
It would all depend on the amount of light that southern facing facade gets. It probably wouldn't get direct sunlight certainly in the summer months. It may get a little bit of sunlight in perhaps the winter months, depending on its aspect. So it really goes down to the amount of direct sunlight it's getting. And no, I would say that generally speaking, you wouldn't get that same blindingly white, bright white, because it's just not getting that same level of direct sunlight.
Now, another one from Dominique, and I can probably answer a little bit of this one, is how much does a colour change from a paint swatch sample to paint on the wall? Now, we strike this quite often where we're called to site because of pretty much everything you've been talking about today. Is the perceived colour when it's up comes across a little bit different, and so it's not uncommon for us to need to pop out to site and just show. And certainly there's a really interesting slide partway through there where you showed the difference in textured surfaces, and our color samples are always, or swatches are always on a nice smooth surface. They are, most of them are paint, so once it's on the textured surface, can look a little bit different. So so yes, we strike that. And what's your view on that one, Zena, as well?
Oh, look, absolutely. You know, texture does have such an impact. And as you say, you know, the color samples and the fan decks and so on are always on a smooth surface. So any kind of textured surface will throw up some of those little shadows to a lesser or a greater degree. So yeah, and my suggestion is to opt for a slightly lighter, brighter color, if you like, to offset those little shadows that the texture will create.
Quick question from Sarah is, when you say paint out a large sample area, they get lots of shade and light, what's the size that you actually recommend to do that?
So because interior spaces and also exterior facades always tend to vary depending on the amount of light that they're getting, I always do those painted samples, and I generally go with quite a large space, quite a large area, about 1 metre, and I very often do 2 of those. So I'll do 1 metre in, say, direct light, an area that gets direct light, and 1 metre in an area that's in shadow. And I find that is a great way of basically double checking that the specified color is what you want when it's actually in situ, both in terms of an area that gets a lot of light and an area that is in shadow. So yeah, about
Very
a
good.
metre
And,
at least.
yeah, I'll just, our test pots that we have as well, which is interesting that yours is 1 square metre, because our test pots cover about 1 square metre. So they're perfect. It's what they're for, to throw your colours up on your walls, interior, exterior, and see what it looks like in the environment that you're decorating in. Another one from Sarah as well is, and this is probably more for us, so it's something that I'll come back to Sarah on after the webinar, is do you have a written fact sheet or information that we can send out to trades to educate them about the liability of swapping out specified colours? And when you say specified colours there, Sarah, I assume you mean paint suppliers. And again, I can answer a little bit of this, where it's not uncommon for us to get called to sites to have a look at something that's not the correct colour, and then to actually find out that it's not even Resene paint that's on the wall. So we do match colours. Every paint manufacturer matches colours, but we do try and stress that they're almost always very, very good colour matches, but they're never exact. And as Zena's mentioned, they're in different products, and so the colours can look different. So what we try and do is make sure where Resene colours are specified, then use Resene paint. And if someone else's colour is specified, it's probably a good idea to use their paint, and then no one has issues. So that's one that I'll cover off, Zena, after the webinar. One more here as well, which is an interesting one from Adam. And again, this is another one that we strike fairly regularly. If you want your ceiling and wall whites to match, should paint colours be different?
Look, that's a very good question. And again, it goes back to that issue of shadows and light, the amount of light that a space gets. So very often corner areas in a room may be quite dark because of the shadow. It's, that corner area may not be getting as much light as a wall that's facing the window. And the same can happen with a ceiling. Areas of the ceiling may not be getting as much natural light as other parts of the ceiling or other parts of the walls around the room. So again, it's good to, if you want to use the same color, and many people do, is to do colored samples on the ceiling as well. Alternatively, to avoid that problem a little, is to go with a slightly lighter color in terms of tonal value, because that will help to offset some of those variations with the shadows on the ceiling and the shadows on the in some parts of the ceiling, but not others. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's a topic that, again, another one that we strike quite often, and there's a little bit of the painter's trick out there, is where, say for example, an alabaster is specified on a ceiling. It's not uncommon for painters to actually go with half alabaster, because once the colour's in a ceiling flat, the colour is darker. Now we do, in our systems, we account for that on a lot of our colours, and we've actually adjusted our tint formulations to actually match the product that it's going in. So sometimes that can also catch a painter out, because we've already adjusted our tint in our tinting programs to account for the difference in colour. But I would say that out there, if anyone has the expectation that their walls and ceilings will look exactly the same, you will always be disappointed, because they will never look the same. So that people need to be aware of that and take that into account.
Absolutely.
Now that does bring us to the end, Zena. We've had some good questions there, and as I mentioned before, it was a super interesting presentation again today, that I'm sure those that have viewed it are going to want to watch that one again, because there's so much information in there that's really useful, getting messages across to clients. Now, if anyone's wanting Zena's contact details, they will be in the follow-up email that will come out tomorrow. So website and email address, I think, is on there, and they can contact you directly if they feel the need. And as mentioned, the webinar will be available in the next day or two online on our website to actually view again at your leisure. So thanks again, Zena, for the presentation today. To everyone out there watching, stay safe, and we will see you next time at our next webinar.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.